So I'm going to make a video responding to Teal dear, responding to Steve Shives. I commented on Bad Mouse Productions video basically saying that if I ever make a response to Teal dear, I'm going to not play any of his clips because he's got a really annoying voice that just sounds so fucking irritating. So I'm going to summarize his points. Also, being that he's just an irritating person, I'm not going to respond to the whole video. I just gave up at about the 25-minute mark. And he doesn't even respond to Steve Shives that much. He goes on a big tangent about male on female, female on male domestic abuse, or domestic abuse against men, which, you know, is really a subject for another time. Anyway, so the first thing that you'll notice is that Teal dear doesn't understand what the word essentially means, because Steve Shive says the men's rights movement is essentially misogynistic, but they bring up good points. And Teal dear says, well, I guess that makes you a misogynist. There we go. Even though I'm going to summarize his points, I'm still going to subject you to his voice. Well, no, because the KKK could say, for example, homelessness is a bad thing. Now, the KKK are essentially racist, as in racism is a key part of what the organization is. But acknowledging that they make good points, like if one of them says homelessness is a bad thing, doesn't mean that I am racist. It doesn't mean I agree with their essential principles. And likewise, I don't agree with the MRA's essential principles, which I believe to be essentially misogynistic, but I agree that they make good points. That's... I don't know what you think the word essentially means, but it means that the essence of what they are is misogynistic. It doesn't mean that everything that they say is misogynistic. You also claim that not caring about women and their issues doesn't make you misogynistic, and, you know, no, because you live in a society where women are in a worse off situation, generally speaking, and it's at least callous of you to ignore the issues that women face. Now, if you decry the steps towards greater equality for women, then you are downright reprehensible. And yes, if you're going to spend ages arguing against feminists who are working towards advancing women, then I can't draw any other conclusion than you don't want women to achieve equality, you don't want the advancement of women's rights, and therefore you are misogynistic. Now, he tries to make the analogy, well, if you're not actively donating to blind people or, you know, care for blind people, then that must mean you're misogynistic. But no one said that. No one's saying that MRAs are misogynistic because they are not actively donating and working with women. They're saying MRAs are misogynistic because they ignore and they refuse to acknowledge the issues women face. And likewise, if someone did say, I don't see what blind people are complaining about, being blind should just be fine, you know, I don't see why they've got to make a big deal out of it, I don't see why they've got to get in my faces about it, then yeah, I'd say that person's number one a prick, and yes, they probably hate blind people. I welcome advances for blind people. He also, of course, says, well, if you're ignoring male privilege, or female privilege, and the problems faced by men, then I guess that makes you a misandrist. Again, I welcome achievements for, or advances for the rights of men. I welcome getting rid of the draft. I welcome getting rid of circumcision when you're of too young an age to consent to that. You know, I welcome fairer laws about custody, things like that. So no, I'm not misogynistic, and I don't deny for a second that there are problems men face. Now, he also says that Steve Shives says that MRAs. Steve Shives says that MRAs are ignoring male privilege and focusing those on female privilege. And Teal says, well, feminists do the opposite. They ignore female privilege and focus entirely on male privilege. So therefore, they must be misandrous. And there are a few things. Number one, he gives examples of people who deny that any sort of female privilege exists, or that men are worse off in any way. I don't think he gives examples of people who deny that men are worse off in any way, but of course I'm sure those people do exist. Sure, those feminists. I'm not denying for a second, I don't think I ever have denied, that there are some feminists who are misandrous. I would also say I think sometimes it can be just a semantic error, an error in the way that people argue their points. I think, obviously feminism is right now quite a decentralized movement, and lots of people might be saying or believing the same things, saying them in different ways. I think it would be interesting if you did have a more central, vocal feminist academic circle which was saying one thing or another, and you could really, see which groups actually acknowledge, according to certain definitions, that female privilege exists, and things like that. I don't think that just because someone says female privilege doesn't exist or there isn't sexism against men, that might be because of the way they're defining sexism, that might be because of the way they're defining privilege. It's not quite as simple as them saying, everything's fine for men. Maybe they do believe that, yes. If anyone says that, I would argue they are being misandrist. Now, the other thing you should consider is that Steve Shives wasn't saying that they're wrong for focusing on female privilege and downplaying male privilege in and of itself. They were wrong to do that because in doing so they were promoting an inaccurate representation of the problem when it comes to sexism. Whereas feminists who downplay female privilege and focus on male privilege are providing an accurate representation of the problem that sexism presents, because the problem that sexism presents is mainly rooted in the problem of male privilege, and very rarely do we need to focus on female privilege. And the point is that is correct. It's not that simply saying that is what makes someone misogynistic or misandrous. It's that saying that when it is an accurate representation of the problem is a better way of solving the problem. He also says something similar, which I've got some loose notes and I can't bother to watch the video again, but basically my response is the same. So whatever point he makes after that, my response is the same. It's not the fact that they're doing it, it's not the fact MRAs are doing that thing, it's the fact they're wrong to do that because it doesn't represent the problem. Then he claims that most men won't run the world and that there have been thousands of female leaders and therefore there isn't a male privilege when it comes to politics and being a member of the head of state. What? Just because lots of men won't get to do that doesn't mean that it's not a privilege that is more likely to be afforded to men than it is to women. Yes, okay, there are more relevant privileges when it comes to running the world. Being born, if we're going to go back to monarchical times, just as an analogy because it's easier to explain things that way, being born into the royal family is probably the single biggest fucking privilege when it comes to whether or not you're going to be the future head of state. However, being born into the royal family and being born a boy is better than being born into a royal family and being born a girl. So even though the biggest privilege in terms of the situation you're born into is that you are born into the royal family, that doesn't change the fact that there is still a privilege associated with being a man. Now, if you want to talk about actual democratic situation, the privilege there is a little more complicated. You know, there's lots of things that will affect whether or not someone's likely to enter into government. Generally speaking, if you're born into a richer household, if you're born into, you know, even if you've got better parents, if you go to a private school, if you end up going to Oxford or Cambridge, if you're wealthy, if you've got connections, you know, nepotism, things like that, these are privileges that are likely to help you. And yes, those privileges aren't gendered in principle, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also certain things where being a man helps. And I think, yeah, there's a male privilege when it comes to whether or not you're going to become a politician that may not be, you know... Yes, technically speaking, if my goal was to become Prime Minister or whatever, I'd rather be a woman who was born into a wealthy family, sent to private school, went to Oxford, Cambridge, had loads of business connections, and my family knew some of the wealthiest people. I'd rather be a woman in that situation than a man who's born in a council house in Luton and, you know, doesn't have any sort of motivation to get into politics at all. That's obvious. But the best position to be in would be to have all of those, you know, all the things I mentioned for the woman, be born into a family of lots of nepotism, lots of money, good connections, things like that, and be a man. Better to be a man in that situation. Now, he says MRAs don't minimise domestic violence by focusing on violence against men. They maximise it, which sounds intuitive, but they downplay domestic violence against women to stress the importance of domestic violence against men. However, they do seem to only treat domestic violence against men as an issue when they can use it to undermine feminist concern for domestic violence against women. So they're undermining domestic violence against women. And even though they might claim to care about domestic violence against men, for the most part, they will bring it up more often as a means to undermine domestic violence against women than as something that they actually really want to campaign for. So, you know, for example, people who maximise the concern of domestic violence would be people, you know, like me, who say, yes, there is a massive problem with domestic violence against men, it needs to be dealt with, it's a real, you know, bummer that people don't take it seriously. There's also massive problems with domestic violence against women, and for the most part, these problems can be solved through a general, non-gendered campaign against domestic violence. At times, it might be important to consider that there are different situations that can lead to domestic violence for the two genders. Obviously, with men, it's mostly domestic violence is prevalent because people don't care about it, whereas with women, it's more likely the case that domestic violence is prevalent because women don't. You know, there's the gender pay gap, which is a big problem with domestic violence because it means women are more likely to want to stay in abusive relationships if, you know, they're not making enough money to support themselves. But aside from the gender wage gap, there's also the fact that men are physically stronger. So obviously they are two different issues, but I care equally, or I care. I wouldn't say I care equally about both, because I think there's slightly more domestic violence against women, if not a lot more domestic violence against women. It's hard to say. So obviously I care more about the bigger problem, but I like to think that I care about them proportionally according to the amount of immediate harm they cause for the general aggregate of humanity. Now, that's all I've really got to say. This is just quite a brief video, but, you know, I was watching it and I was thinking, well, it was mostly the fact that I just couldn't believe how much he buggered up his definition of essentially. But other than that, I just thought some of the other things he said were a bit wrong. So thank you for watching, guys. Ta-ra.